Well, good evening.
And welcome. So in this class, we'll be talking about organizational culture, and the readings was chapter 3 from your textbook on changing culture. Now, back when we did our psychological contract activity, guys asked me to give you perspectives on what the real world is like. And I teach you things that are applicable to the real world. What does that mean? What's the real world? You're the only one here. There's others on Zoom. You can come at us. What is the real world?
I think in that context, maybe in my mind, if I ask for real life examples, I mean like or real life organizational examples, or how what we learn in class can apply to the work world, I guess, and the workforce. Sorry, that's my dog.
So what kind of dog is it?
He's a golden retriever and he's 11 months old and he just got a new toy.
It's a squeak toy. Okay. That sounds very cute. So in this, we might mean different things by the real world. And I'm hearing that maybe it's outside of academia, where you come as a student to learn, and then you're going to go out and work and apply your knowledge and your skills. So that's one thing we can mean by real world. And then you might be referring to what is real versus what is myth. So much of what you encounter from an organization and believe in a textbook is to some extent myth and narrative. And there may well be, we hope there is, some component of truth, but important skill is disentangling that from myth and narrative, or at least understanding and recognizing the roles of myth and narrative. When we talk about the real world, it assumes that there was like one real world out there. And in reality, that itself is a myth. So there's no place or position where you ever live in the whole one world, right, where you are on top of the world. That is a mythical place and a mythical idea. So let's say that you are on top of the world. Maybe you're the leader of the free world, the president of the United States. He still lives in a microcosm. He still has a little world. So there's a few people he sees. There's a cast of characters, his family, his close party colleagues, government directors, military generals, security guards, reporters he talks to. It's not everyone. Doesn't see everyone. There's a small, pretty select group. And there's a few places that he can go. He doesn't go everywhere, right? You can't just go down to Pizza Corner and get a donaire and chat with the common folk. He goes to the White House, Air Force One rallies. So he has a little world. It's a very high profile and a very powerful little world, but it's still a microcosm. There is so much that he does not see and does not know, and information that never reaches him. Behind every one of those windows that you would see in an office building is a little world, a microcosm. And all of those microcosms come with a culture. There's norms and scripts and roles. There's some projects that we're working on, and there's some interpersonal drama. There's the boss and the secretary and the time that some lackey got chewed out in a meeting. And upstairs or across the road, there's some other microcosm with its own cast of characters and its plots and its intrigues that no one knows or even cares about in the other tiny microcosms. And there's millions and millions of those microcosms. So this here now is a real world, right? This is my real world. This is my workplace, and it's yours for like another 10 weeks. But then, you'll move on. It'll evaporate and you'll be in a new microcosm. And you're probably in a number of microcosms at this time. But that is somebody's real world. We might not take a lot of notice of facilities in the bathrooms and who cleans them and how they get cleaned, but that's someone's real world. People who sell our food, they have a real world. One of the things that you'll learn about if you take the history of IO psychology is about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in New York in 1911. And has anyone heard of that? Have you learned about it yet? Maybe in like, have you taken occupational health psychology or organizational psychology? Yeah, it comes up a lot in IO psych. So that was a terrible manufacturing tragedy where women who worked sewing shirts were locked inside on the factory floor. And so when something in a bin caught fire, they couldn't get out. And they ended up having to jump off the roof to their deaths. And we do pay attention to the well-being of young white women. So there were many improvements in safety. And IO psychologists will take credit for that. But what you won't hear about is something like that. Does anyone recognize that picture?
Bangladesh?
It is Bangladesh. So that is Rana Plaza in Dhaka, Bangladesh in 2013. And those are the labels like Joe Fresh, Walmart, Zara, Benetton that we wear in the rubble. And those are the people that sewed our clothes in the rubble. So we don't talk about how we outsourced manufacturing to people in places that don't have those basic safety protections, whose well-being doesn't seem to matter, because some of our real worlds are much more real to us than others. So when we talk like there is one world, what we actually do is take a position, a vantage point, and it's probably the vantage point of a powerful or a privileged group. So sometimes you'll hear Americans talking about America as if it was like the whole world and there weren't other countries. So when we talk or teach or think about life as if that perspective, which is a privileged subjectivity, is actually some general universal truth, when we do that, we're marginalizing and neglecting the very real worlds and experience of others who have lower social status. It's a lot of people and a lot of worlds, right? And they're real. They have real people, real roles, real relationships, real responsibilities. They make real contributions. They have real cultures. So what is organizational culture? Basically, the way things are done. The system of shared values and beliefs that interact with an organization's people, structure, and systems to produce behavioral norms. Norms are the way we do things. And it perpetuates itself over time because you are rewarded for accepting and acting out the norms, and you are punished or ostracized for rejecting the norms. You get trained into it. And culture is important to understand because it is a key to organizational success. It needs to be well adapted to the organization's environment, to what the organization needs to do in its context. And sometimes it isn't. It needs, as an invisible script of norms, it needs to guide organization members to do things in a way that's adaptive. Here's Edgar Schein's definition of organizational culture. It's a pattern of basic assumptions invented, discovered, or developed by a given group. I'm going to pause there for a minute. By a given group. There's often an assumption that everybody gets to participate in culture and defining culture. That's not really the case, okay? That given group is probably a small group of people at the top, more so than the people on the bottom. Okay, so it's a pattern of basic assumptions, invented, discovered, developed However they got them by a given group as it learns to cope with its problems of external adaptation and internal integration. There's two kinds of problem there, external and internal. And this has worked well enough to be considered valid. And therefore, it's taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to these problems. External problems, how do we deal with external stakeholders? What are we offering to the external environment? And internal problems, which refers to all that political stuff, okay? So an organization comes together for a purpose. When we defined an organization, we know that it's an entity of some kind that has one or more people who have a common purpose. And that purpose usually represents a problem. So there are not enough widgets, we will make more widgets. We need jobs, we can create jobs making widgets. So let's say that the organization has the purpose of making women's shoes. So that's solving a problem, the problem that women do not have enough shoes. And if women believe that's a problem, and many do, then you have a business. But then if women realize, maybe they take stock of their lives during the pandemic, that they don't really need more shoes, and what really matters is your relationships, now your business has a problem. So what problem is this organization solving? This one, yeah.
Oh.
Is there a problem is music?
People's desire to think more critically, to be more educated, to further their careers.
Okay, so people want to learn, people want to further their careers. We could see a university as, or an organization as having multiple functions in society. So I think that's true, and it may also do other things. Historically, like what have universities done over time? They have done that, and they've also educated and socialized the sons of the elite. So people want careers, but these are kind of certain kinds of careers. University isn't a vocational college. So if you want a career in HVAC, we don't seem to study that here. And so there's a lot of knowledge and learning that are on topics that are outside of what we usually learn about. So we learn about things like philosophy and sociology, but how to bake a good pastry, how to change the oil in a car, those more practical things are things that we teach in a community college. So the university does tend to represent the interests in terms of knowledge or learning of career of people who are upper social class, social status. And in life, the decision makers often have degrees, and the people who the decisions are made about often don't. So culture is something that is reflected in artifacts. Artifacts refer to the physical and social environment and to things that you can see and observe, to the physical space, to written and spoken language, to observable behavior, to how people dress. I have a question in the chat. Would you argue that they historically had a limited target demographic? So this is a question about the social function of universities. And yes, I would argue that historically universities have had a limited target demographic. So 100 years ago, who's going to university as a student, it would be the sons of the elite and maybe some very gifted or talented people who were outside of that group. But historically, it wasn't women or people from the working class. But if you are a child of the aristocracy or the upper class, it's expected that you go to university. And if you looked at the really elite universities, places like Harvard, and you say, who goes there? Well, who does go there as a student?
I think you still see a lot of that at those upper kind of universities. Like, you know, it's, oh, my parents went here, my grandparents
Yeah.
went here. Like, you see a lot of that kind of pattern.
Yes.
And a lot of emphasis on like, oh, your parents are alum, or you know what I mean? I think you still see that a lot.
Yeah, that kind of generational thing about heritage and generational wealth is a characteristic of class privilege. Sorry, my clicker seems to stops working. So culture has this level where you can see it, where it's visible, and then it also has deeper levels that are invisible. So culture is taken for granted, it's invisible, it's unconscious, especially when you're in it, right? When you were in a culture, it's really hard to see it because it's normal. It's just the way things are, the way things are done. It's like you can't see the forest for the trees. So by way of example, people in white or Anglo majority cultures who belong to that dominant group often feel like they don't have a culture. They don't have a race. They don't have an ethnicity. They're just normal, and what they do is normal. But they see outsiders as having an ethnicity, as being from an ethnic group. Well, if you're white or Anglo, that's an ethnic group too, right? So think about the grocery aisle. If there's an ethnic food aisle, that doesn't have our ethnic food in it. Ketchup is an ethnic food. It's British in origin, and it's popular in the British diaspora, so places like Canada, the United States, and Australia. And there are parts of the world where ketchup isn't normal, right? Where it's seen as an abomination. And in 2011, the French banned it from school cafeterias. They're allowed to have it on Fridays with their fleets, but they didn't want ketchup in the school because they want to maintain French culture, where ketchup isn't the norm. So artifacts include tangible, overt, verbally identifiable elements in an organization. So it's things like the furniture, the buildings, the architecture, what people are wearing, the kind of jokes they make. Okay? So they're visible, by which I mean observable, and they can be seen and recognized by people who are not part of the culture. And there in the figure, under what we see, that refers to artifacts, has behaviors. So as you know, as psychology students, anything you do that's a behavior is something observable. And it also has systems, that you can map out, processes that you can go find on the website or that are in some manual somewhere, and also policies. So policy is an artifact because I can go on the HR website and find a bunch of policies. Then we can go deeper. So organizations have values that they espouse. They're stated values and rules of behavior. It's kind of how those refer to how members represent the organizations to themselves and to the others. So a big one with SMU is community. And it's often expressed in kind of official statements, public statements about identity and advertising. Or maybe let's say there's a company where they say we feel like a family. That would be a value. And an issue there is that sometimes the values that an organization espouses aren't really the ones that represent how things operate. And so as OD practitioners, you need to be aware of that, okay? That sometimes articulated values are not practiced values. Then the deepest level is the level of assumptions. And assumptions are like statements that we believe to be true, right? A nurse should care about patients. Or a teacher should know what they're talking about. And some of those can be very adaptive, and then sometimes they're not adaptive. But what's tough about culture is that the assumptions are invisible, and you have to dig for them and infer them. You can see the artifacts. It's harder with values. Values are about what people say and how they say it, and you pick it up in the advertising. But there's this iffiness where you're not sure whether the articulated values and the practice values are the same. And then it gets much tougher to read them at the level of the assumptions because you're working with inference. So can we look at these pictures? And what could you read from this? Organization A and organization B.
Is the organization A values collaboration?
Okay, so we have 3 levels. We have artifacts, and we have values. You just inferred a value from an artifact, and then you have assumptions. We can see these, we can read the values, and we may or may not be able to get at assumptions. We can make inferences, but you think that they value collaboration.
Yeah. So
okay.
They're seated in a circle.
Aha, okay. So you inferred the value of, oh, I wrote value, but what I wanted to write was collaboration. Because of what you saw, which was being seated in a circle. So the circular seating pattern. What does a circle say? Why is a circle collaborative?
I think because it puts everyone at the same like kind of standpoint, I guess. Like nobody's up at the head of the table. Everyone's kind of seen as equal. Sorry for the dog.
Wow. What you said there was very interesting. You said that the circular seating pattern is about collaboration because it puts everyone as equals. So the assumption behind this, and I think this is actually true, and it's a position of OD, is that to have collaboration, you need to be equals. Okay? So that's going to an assumption. So to collaborate effectively, people should be equals. What about organization B?
Authoritative so the artifact of them sitting at a table and all facing the one person who's clearly in charge. You
are facing the one person who's clearly in charge. And why do you say that? I mean, they're all dressed the same, so why is he in charge?
I think it's the whole like head of the table kind of concept.
Head of the table. So there's a head of one person is distinguished.
Yeah.
Put at the head of the table, and we're all looking to that person for direction.
And there's perhaps a his personal assistant or a second level down from him seated who's facing everybody else as well, but he's not at the head of the table. So.
Yeah, so it's fascinating that you picked that up. Okay, so all these people are looking at this guy, and wow, you're looking at this guy.
Yeah.
Tell me what you see in this guy.
I also noticed it looks like the individual at the head of the table is the only one who doesn't have out like pen and paper. So obviously he's like heading this meeting or giving out information that is of value to these other individuals.
This is fascinating. I never noticed these things before. So like, wow, that is so true. They're writing and taking notes, and he's kind of giving direction. So
he doesn't need to write anything down because he knows everything already.
These are assumptions. They're excellent assumptions. You guys are on the ball, but I want to keep separating the artifact. So the artifact is there's this one person who has the head of the table, who does not write, and who has this other person next to him. I don't know how to write that. What's the artifact?
Visible essential assistance, maybe? I don't know.
Like, I don't know.
Can you mute whoever that is? That's
Yeah,
not muted?
What I'm just going to do is turn down the volume because I don't know what else to do.
I don't even know what to do.
Sam, could you please mute?
So it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Oh no, that's not Sam.
See,
That's someone else. Okay. Dana, there. Okay. No problem. Where were we? We didn't know how to define this artifact. I don't know how to define that, but it's important.
Yeah.
There's another person that is nearby and overlooking.
Smaller group, smaller management group.
Kind of.
Seems like it's led by the guy at the head of the table.
Yes.
And kind of, helped or assisted or something by the other guy.
So we
I
always
don't know how to describe that.
want to keep the artifacts totally objective. So we can always kind of agree on that. But then we start making inferences about values and assumptions. So what values are you seeing in organization B?
I feel like you would make the assumption that they do value kind of position and power more so than collaborative.
Excellent. They value power. So one of the big differences in these two pictures is power distance. And power distance refers to the relationship between authority and subordinate individuals, and it depends on how the latter, the subordinates, react to the former. And how are your subordinates reacting?
They're all paying attention.
Yes, they're paying attention.
They're all wearing the same clothing, too.
They're wearing the same clothing. So power and conformity. And what was it you said in class the other day about unity? And we're all dressed like this guy.
Yeah.
So what might be an assumption in this workplace? Like a basic assumption.
Strength in numbers?
Strength in numbers, what does that mean?
So they're not so much collaborating as they are serving.
Yes.
Serving one person, serving one
and
predetermined.
So we're serving one person, and that's an assumption, right? The assumption is we should follow the leader.
Yeah.
We should have a leader. Right? We should have a leader. That might be in an organization be a leaderless discussion. We should have a leader, and we should follow the leader. Awesome. Okay. Now what about this room? What's an artifact in this room?
I'm sitting here.
Okay, so
nobody else is in the room.
So the student sits.
There's a hurricane coming, I
guess.
Okay. Teacher standing and lecturing.
Yeah, teacher standing. And so one thing you're observing is that there's kind of hybrid participation.
I think in some way you would be our leader because you are the professor of this class. So we are learning something from you.
So that's not an artifact. You're making assumptions or there's values. And I think we went, so the assumption is that you should be learning from me. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, like the students would be there to learn and you'd be more like the boss or the leader.
Students learn from teacher. Teacher is in charge. Is a leader.
I would say, so I can't see the people in the video, but I'm dressed casually.
Yeah, there are 8 people on video.
8 people. I'm dressed casually, you're dressed professionally.
Yeah,
indicating you're part of a separate group than I am. You're faculty, instructors.
So
I'm a
student dresses casually. And then the teacher dresses professionally. What does that mean?
Probably indicates in some way that you're held to a higher standard than I am.
But why is this professional? If I were to wear my pajamas, that would not be professional. We'll get back to that. Okay. And actually, I might as well just tell you, it demonstrates structure. So a suit is structured and tailored.
Yeah.
Versus, sorry?
Is that a suit? Is that what
You got the jacket over here.
Okay, so yeah.
And it's structured and tailored, and there's darts and things like that. And whereas casual clothes show less structure. They show more yielding. They're floppy and they're softer. And Mark says, pivotal norms relating to university. I don't understand the question. You're welcome to just speak out or type. Oh, so Mark, what you might be saying is that the dress is a pivotal norm about how faculty behave. And I'm going to answer that with a question. Have you seen any faculty not wearing a suit? And you say yes. And if you can get away with not wearing a suit, is wearing a suit a pivotal or a peripheral norm?
Peripheral.
Perfect. Okay. So
it's centrally related to your job.
It's
on the periphery of what you do. Teaching the class and research.
Yes.
Central. It's pivotal.
But if I taught a class on ballroom dance, I'd be like, no, that would not be okay. I could probably lose my job for that. But if I came here dressed in my pajamas, you'd look at me a little funny, but it probably wouldn't go anywhere. So according to your textbook, there's this socialization process where you come into an organization with your expectations about what it's like and what you should do and what the norms are. And then you can encounter the actual culture, and that can be a shock for people. And then you adjust according to this diagram and receive feedback on your performance. I'm not really buying this arrangement. I don't see why you can't get feedback before you adjust. And sometimes people mentor you and show you the ropes. And when you start, they take you aside and they're like, hey, you really should do this and not that. Not in the employee manual, but these are where the landmines are. So I think this is at least a cycle where you keep receiving feedback, you keep encountering different parts of the culture, and you keep adjusting your expectations. So if you were to reject all the values and norms, then you'd be rebelling completely. So that would be off to one extreme, or total conformity would be accepting all the values and norms. But you can achieve a place that they're calling creative individualism, where you must accept the pivotal norms, but you can reject some of the peripheral norms. They say like rejection of all others. I don't think you have to reject all of them, but that gives you some room to bring your own values in. And someone says, I think it happens a lot with companies that value job shadowing. I don't quite follow.
Sorry, just from the last slide, how you said you don't really agree with the order totally.
Yeah.
I kind of agree because if you know, a lot of jobs use job shadowing as part of training now. And I think that you receive a lot of feedback from job shadowing someone. That's not
Yeah.
necessarily like the job on
Oh,
paper or the things
fascinating.
that the manual tells you, you know.
Yeah, you see it happening to them. It's like observational learning. So there's a lot of things missing here. And I want to point this out to you because management textbooks have a lot of things that just sound like they're fact and they might be kind of shady. So please be aware of that. Cultures do tend to polarize over time because organizations attract and retain people who are a fit for a culture. That means that your personal values and the organization's practice values are aligned. And then people who are not a culture fit get in trouble or leave. But to be an adaptive organization, you need those other perspectives. And so unfortunately, they can polarize. Employee engagement is not a good thing if you're not a culture fit. So the research suggests that if people who are not a fit for the culture engage, yay, employee engagement, they end up being stressed and burned out, which makes sense because they're engaging with something that is not a fit for them. Another figure from your textbook says the culture comes from two subsystems. I find that this textbook can provide information that's contradictory. And that can come, let's say, from different models. The way I'm interpreting this, because you've learned that there are 5 subsystems, and that management unites and coordinates the 4. What I think they're doing here is that they're pulling out management as one subsystem and then lumping the other 4 together and saying that culture comes from management and everything else. And the actual exigencies of a job, of a task, of a role do determine culture to some extent. So hospitals have to value teamwork because you cannot do surgery or diagnose and treat a patient on your own. That arises from the exigencies of the tasks. I do like that this emphasizes the strong role of management in leading culture. And because management has the power of modeling and it has the power to reward and to sanction. And this sort of suggests that it matters as much as everything else combined. Sometimes we assume that there's a total organizational culture, but a culture belongs to a stable group with a shared experience. And so your textbook talks about strong organizational cultures. What does that mean? Well, to have a strong overall organizational culture, that would require the whole organization to have a significant kind of shared history and experience and be working together. It's not always the case. Sometimes organizations are siloed into different parts. Okay, it can be silos and then cliques of people who like and trust and work together, who have their own ways of doing things. And those subcultures and groups can even predominate over the well-being or the goals of the organization as a whole. And when you have that kind of conflict, you'd end up with a weak overall culture. So does a university as a whole have a culture, and what culture is that? Well, the group that has the most power is faculty, along with the administrators, who are usually faculty serving limited terms. When they're done, they go back to being faculty. So it's, the answer to that question is basically faculty. So the university culture, to the extent that we have an overall culture, is going to represent faculty culture. So culture is reflected in norms. I think we've talked about the pivotal and the peripheral norms. I'm going to add something to what the textbook says. So they say that the pivotal norms are essential to accomplishing the organization's objectives. I'm going to edit that to say assumed to be essential. Because let's say you have an organization with a strict dress code or management all wear suits. What would actually happen if they stopped wearing suits? Would the whole system collapse? Probably not. And so same for peripheral norms. These are the ones that support and contribute to the pivotal norms, and they're not assumed to be essential to the organization's objective. For me, teaching quality, caring about teaching, putting extra time to teach is not a pivotal norm, not a pivotal thing, right? It's a bit peripheral. But what's in the interests of the institution that relies on tuition from students? Like maybe good quality teaching should be a pivotal norm. The norm for different industries have different norms, different professions have different norms. But a norm for a nurse is to say be personally caring about the patient. Maybe the norm for the doctor is to be dispassionate. And what's the norm represents narratives, and the function of a narrative is to be a guide for your behavior, to tell you what is the next thing you should do, how you should act, how you should respond. So a nurse could draw on that norm or narrative of caring to decide how to act toward a patient, right? By asking you how you're feeling, taking time to listen, saying, you know, does that hurt? Each profession, each industry, each organization will have pivotal norms. And these are ideally the ones that you must observe, right? If you're a greengrocer, you need to value freshness in food, or else, okay? Like a teacher has to know their stuff. A mediator has to be impartial. In practice, organizational mediators can be very partial. So I don't like the way I arranged my slides. So those are norms, which are how we do things. And norms are connected to values. And the values go back to how an organization solves problems. And values are represented in the way we chose to solve a problem. So let's say that there's a badly behaved child in a family. Well, what are you going to do about that? If you spank the child, that represents values that are driving that decision, right? Or if you give them a timeout, there's different values behind that. Or if you talk it over, there's a different value behind that. Versus if you just ignore it, there are different values behind that. And so culture ultimately reflects, some organizational culture ultimately reflects someone's values, and that's usually the founder's values or the leader's values. So organizational culture is the flip side of leadership. And organizational culture will reflect a lot about the leader's personality and values, or the founder's personality and values. Edgar Schein argues that culture and leadership in a hierarchical organization are two sides of the same coin, and that the organizational culture is rooted in the personality, values, beliefs of a leader. I can see that in say, counseling psychology, which is quite a libertarian field that's very social justice oriented. And I see how that connects to the founder, Frank Parsons' values. He was very into empowering people, and everyone has a voice, and find your talent so that you can go contribute to the world. Like it's like 100 years since Frank Parsons wrote his first book on the subject of vocational psychology, and we're still following in his footsteps. It's quite a powerful effect. Those values are sometimes articulated, and then they're sometimes invisible to us. So if the value has like a strong guiding function, then it'll be articulated, right? The nurses care, and the teachers know their stuff, but they can become so ingrained that they're taken for granted and they drop out of conscious awareness. So if a solution, a way of doing something works very reliably over and over time, it becomes an assumption. and it drops out of awareness. Now here, I'll give you an example of when this happens. So you'll hear terms like professional, right? Respect, respectful. Hear words like civility, words like appropriate and inappropriate. But if you ask, okay, what does respect mean? What does that mean? So oftentimes, just like we did with my suit, the person might not know why. They just know that it is. We know that this is a professional thing to wear, but it could be hard to articulate why. And maybe the reason why is because that's how the administrators dress, and we believe in follow the leader. And maybe it expresses dominance through its structure. But the point is that there's something about that that has become unconscious. And so they talk about respectful workplaces, and you ask people, okay, so what is respect? What does respect mean? Right? They typically don't know. In a high power difference culture, respect often means deference to the superiors.
Wouldn't that be where a suit comes from? Probably from military applications, where each rank has a certain kind of garb, basically, an indication of which group they belong to, which level of the structure they belong to.
Yeah. Yes. It's kind of signaling which group you belong to. So that could be a function of the suit. But why do they choose a suit? Why isn't it robes? And in some countries, it probably is robes. Like in Saudi Arabia, that's what they wear. I don't know if that's what I don't think it's what the military people would wear. So in the IO psychology program here, an academic culture is a high power distance culture. You'll hear a lot about respect and civility. And if you kind of dig into it and hear, well, what kind of incidents are they talking about? One that comes up a lot is that students might start an email with, hi, Carla, instead of dear Dr. Knight. And that's a problem because the student's being uncivil. And what that really indicates to me is that the student just didn't show the deference of being like, dear Dr. So-and-so. But this is like a big concern for people, right? Some people's careers are based on studying that. I saw a question. How about in a company with a lot of conformity, strong or weak culture? I don't quite understand. Could you articulate?
Oh, I had sent that just earlier when we were talking about like strong versus weak cultures. And I just thought about like conformity and how that's common in a lot of like organizations. Like over time, people just end up conforming to what's around them and the norms. And I started to kind of wonder in my head, like, it from a first glance, you would think maybe they'd have strong culture because, everyone looks the same, everyone's doing the same kind of thing. But I don't know, I kind of thought about it further, and I think it would maybe represent weak culture because not everyone is really being themselves. They're just conforming to the norms.
Well, it could be a strong culture. Like, let's say that it's a high power distance culture and we do what the leader does and the leader has indicated that this is the way we dress. That's a strong culture.
Right.
But then let's say that the leader is Mark Zuckerberg and he thinks you should wear jeans and a gray t-shirt. And then everyone does that. Or let's say saying, I think you should be comfortable in your clothing. And everyone wears something that is comfortable for them. And those could be completely different things. That too could be a strong culture. I think the strength of culture is about kind of coherence of the values, that we have a common culture, we have common values, instead of we have all these departments that are doing completely different things and there isn't a coherent sense of culture.
Right, that makes sense. Like more collaboration than anything really. Mm-hmm.
So values can be articulated or practiced. They're not the same thing. So people can say we value X, but their behavior might indicate to you that what they really value is Y. And Sam, I think that your comment really drew attention to the fact that it's easy to see the artifact. You can say, oh, these people are dressed the same and they're conforming, but we have to infer what that means in terms of their values, in terms of assumptions. And that game is a tricky game, and it's actually quite hard to do. But I like the way you're You're saying that when you think through it and you're not really sure. So we get more and more uncertain as we read from artifacts through to values, through to assumptions. So there are values that may be generally socially accepted or that are accepted by, say, the clients of the organization. And so an organization might have a pressure to represent those values. That's not necessarily what their values are. So an articulated value, like if we say SMU values community, that can be actually true. That could express hope for the future, like maybe it's not true, but we hope it will be true. Or sometimes they're outright lies, okay? So all organizations have to claim to value equality, diversity, and inclusion and accessibility. You can't really say that you don't unless you're some kind of right-wing conservative think tank. High power distance organizations, I argue, cannot and do not really value equality or inclusion. You can't keep power for a small group of people and also be inclusive, because you have to exclude all those other people from the power group. Or you have to be exclusive. Articulated values still matter, even if they're just optics. I had a picture of the Kleenex there. Back in the day, I remember that my Kleenex boxes used to have this on the bottom. It would say Irving. I might have mixed up my brands. I don't know if Irving owns Kleenex. Whatever tissues that Irving was selling. It said the tree growing company. What does that say?
We value the environment.
Do they value the environment?
Relatively speaking, maybe.
Well, they need the trees to turn them into tissues.
They literally financially value it and take
Yes.
it. And, yeah.
They do. They do. And does Irving grow trees?
I feel like you wouldn't really know the difference, and people probably read that and just assume they do and maybe not look
Yeah, so
further.
you see that and you think, yay, it's the Sierra Club. But what it might mean in practice is that when Irving goes and clear cuts a forest, then they have to go in and do a replant, right? And that's usually a monoculture. It's not done maybe the way the Sierra Club would want you to do it, but they are a company that grows trees. So it's kind of true. And it's also pretty manipulative. And I assume that organizations do a lot of that. But those articulated values still matter, even if they're just optics, because maybe they'll give some money to, I don't know, an environmental organization. Maybe they'll do something because of it. Even if they're kind of a lie, the organization will still need to engage in some kind of virtue signaling. So if you say that you value EDI, and let's say you really don't, you're still going to have to produce a company magazine that has the picture that looks diverse. So it's still going to drive behavior in a certain way. It's not about that it matters, it's more about how it matters. So at the deepest level, culture is about implicit assumptions that we may not even be aware that we have. And I threw a bunch up on a slide. So some company might assume that the product they're making should work. That should be of high quality. Or you might assume that the product should make us a big profit. So then we'll make something shoddy and sell it somehow. Some people think that you have to get the job done properly by an established process. And others might say you get it done by any means. And that organization might act less ethically. In some cultures, you never embarrass a superior, okay? So in a culture that values face saving, a boss might call a subordinate in and say, here's an idea I have. And the subordinate knows that it's a terrible idea and that it will definitely fail. So he says, that's a brilliant idea, and agrees to implement it. And it fails. The boss calls the subordinate in to find out what went wrong. And the subordinate insists that it was in fact definitely a great idea, but it failed due to external circumstances that couldn't be controlled. And there's an implicit assumption at the bottom of that, that might be that somehow, for some reason, you can't criticize this person. In the West, we believe that the individual's rights often supersedes that of the group. And we might find it inconceivable that we should in some way sacrifice ourselves to the group, even if we dishonored the group. But in other cultures, it's the assumption that you do that. So in East Asian cultures, there's a phenomenon of karoshi, right? Overwork death. People die at their desk from starvation or heart attack or stroke from the stress. Or if they brought shame on the company, then they might take their own lives. This is not a problem in the West, because we don't share that implicit assumption, where we're much more individualistic and where individual rights seem to matter more to us. Okay, but in the East, there are collectivistic implicit assumptions that you should lay yourself down for others. You shouldn't bring shame to your family or to your company. So organizational culture ultimately develops out of how the organization solves problems over the long runs and what problems it focuses on. Some cultures are inwardly focused, and it's more about the employees and their careers and the internal politics than the customers. And some cultures are externally focused, and they're really focused on customer service and on their results. There's another dimension, the other dimension in this graph is stability versus flexibility. And I interpret that as attitude to risk-taking, to controlling risk. So some organizations have developed to avoid and minimize risks, and others will actively take risks. And they give people the discretion they need to be creative. And this model here will give you 4 main cultures. So it'll give you bureaucracies, competitive cultures, community cultures, and entrepreneurial cultures. And they value different things. So if we look at the bureaucratic one, then there's a lot of structure, a lot of process. There's a focus on control and efficiency, because we've been solving the same problem for so long that we know how to do it. There's a book about how you do it. You do this, not that. There's a focus on keeping that running smoothly and avoiding risks. And these different cultures are associated with different dominant attributes. So the attributes in a hierarchy or a bureaucracy are orders and rules and regulations and uniformity and conformity. They're associated with different leadership styles. So in a bureaucracy, the leader is like an administrator and a coordinator of those positions that are subordinate. And there's different ways of having relationships with each other. So in a bureaucracy, you can't just go tell somebody something they might need to know. You can't just go do that. Right? Only the person who has the role and the responsibility for conveying that information can convey it in a way that adheres to the policies and procedures. And then maybe the person only hears exactly what they need to know, no more and no less. They hear about something and it's on a need to know basis that's based on what their role and responsibility is. And different cultures have a different strategic emphasis. So in a hierarchy, the strategy is toward achieving stability and predictability, to having things run smoothly and not taking risks. Community clan cultures evolved to solve around solving problems that require collaboration. So people problems. We see these cultures in sort of HR kind of organizations. There's less internal competition and more teamwork. And confrontation and conflict are just less problematized. Right? You can have conflict with leadership, but there's this understanding that, we're a big family here and that's okay. But loyalty and commitment are expected. You see this in HR firms. And this is actually an email that was sent by a vice president in a large company with a clan culture. is actually a Fortune 500 company. It's an HR firm, as you might expect. But if you sort of read that, like what do you see there? From a vice president. Way up there.
It's like they're kind of making light of a serious situation, I guess, which maybe you wouldn't expect from a super high up.
She's joking around. I also noticed that she signed it Susan. It doesn't say head honcho vice president. It's like a first name basis. She starts with team.
Team. I was just going to say she addressed team, which is nice that obviously she involved everybody.
You can see that right there in that email. In a bureaucratic culture, you're going to notice a lot more formality, processes, and policies. They like kind of big buildings, quiet hallways, private offices. And since it's about hierarchy, there's many displays of status and power. So there's titles and ranks and a dress code. And one thing you'll notice is inequality in the use of titles. So the subordinate refers to the superior with a title, Mr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so. And that person will refer to the subordinate, not by their title, right? Not as Miss Smith, but by their first name. So you might see that in academia where some of your instructors expect to be referred to by a title as Professor or Dr. So-and-so, but do they call you Mr. or Mrs.? Or do they assume a first name basis with you? That is a demonstration of power. You can see these power relationships in things like offices and in parking. So some people who are lower ranked have no office, or there's a shared office. Then there's the private office, and then there's like the super swanky private office. And so I went outside and I thought, what can I see in parking? Okay, so that's our main building, and I looked around. So I didn't look too hard, but I noticed a lot of faculty parking only. I noticed one spot for administrators for the president. And now these parking spots that are right in front of the building that say faculty parking only are, I know this because I have watched, used by the vice presidents and associate vice presidents. But there isn't a parking spot that says associate vice president diversity excellence or vice president research, but they park in those spots that say faculty parking only, and they're up in front of the building. There's one spot for people with disabilities. I know there's one spot for the president, and there's only one president. Do you think there could be more than one person with a disability in the institution? Just might. So what does it mean that there's only one spot? Bureaucratic cultures which evolved around solving predictable problems, like doing things by the book, and they don't really like it when people rock the boat, because that could upset things, that could be a risk. And if something embarrassing happens, they might not want to expose that and talk about it openly in a way that we can collaboratively address the problem and fix the system. So they like sweeping it under the rug. And sweeping things under the rug maintains an image that everything's okay. I'm reading, having one spot is like doing something just to say you did it. Yeah, very astute, very astute. It's like, yep, we got that, tick the box. But does that solve an accessibility problem, really? No, it does not. So why does image matter so much in a bureaucracy?
Because it relies on members of the organization following, so they need to know what to follow.
Exactly. So in one way or another, image legitimates the hierarchy. when it comes back to how we address problems, if we openly admit that a mistake happens, it shows that we weren't really in control because we let this mistake somehow happened. But if it didn't happen, that never happened, it means I was always in control, okay? If there was a mistake, it means we might have to make some systemic change to fix things, and that could result in me having less power, right? It opens that risk. And it sends a message to external competition, and mistakes make you look weak. Yep, exactly. That's the way it's sort of thought about in a very hierarchical culture. Yeah, I agree. It makes you vulnerable. In a competitive culture, people want to get down to business, get work done, achieve results, can be very competitive even among co-workers, and leaders can be like demanding taskmasters, and you want to make as much profit and capture as much market share as possible. Sorry?
So it sounds exhausting.
Sounds exhausting, yeah. Yeah, it does. Entrepreneurial cultures evolved to solve complex, ill-structured problems where you need people to be able to be creative. So individuals have high autonomy, they do things that are unconventional, and leaders need to be able to predict shifts in markets so they can develop new technologies. And you see this kind of nimble, malleable organization in a lot of tech firms. So culture represents the kind of problem people are solving. I'm looking at the time, it's 6:36. I predict that I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to pick up speed a bit, and then I will finish the lecture. You're free. You're never my prisoner, always free to leave, but I'll keep going so that you'll have a tape. So how do you measure culture? It's very difficult, right? Even doing this was difficult, especially for an outsider. So you need to talk to people in the organization and be very observant. And then these are some things that you might look for. So you might look for something like team emphasis. Right? You might look at something like autonomy. I don't know if this taxonomy is evidence-based, and it probably isn't. Management textbooks are kind of full of stuff that represent practitioner experience, but they're kind of presented like it's a universal law and way of doing things. But this is what Henry Migliore thinks you should look for. If culture changes, it's often because of external pressure on the organization, where it changes because it has to, or else, okay? So if culture isn't working and you need to change it, what do? Well, you need to have a vision for what you're changing into. So that you need a model for change, and I hear you asking, what does that mean? So where's my model? I lost my slide. Okay, a slide was accidentally deleted. But the model for change that I recall started with convincing people that you need to change. And then they said that you need to change leaders and key decision makers. And then you need them to model the new culture. And then you need to reward and punish people for following along. And then you need to establish kind of symbols and stories that communicate the new culture. I have a chat there. It feels like a lot of companies seem to be reactive and not proactive and wait till there's no other option. Exactly. That is often the case. But then there are some cultures that are always trying to innovate, but they themselves have that kind of entrepreneurial culture that we discussed. It's not about let's turn into a bureaucracy. Sometimes you can benefit from external practitioners with culture change because of that characteristic where you can't see the forest for the trees. It can be hard for internal people to do that. You need to be able to reward the changes and expect a lot of resistance. Okay, there's a lot of things that would need to change, like the leaders. Well, we might miss them. And what, you're just going to change the reinforcement structure on somebody? So there are resources that you can give people for change, Right? You may provide them with information about how the company is run, the problems that they're facing, let them communicate with each other. I provide training. And then management needs to support risk-taking, right? Otherwise it won't happen. And one way that management can support risk-taking is by creating something called sandboxes. So it's like, let's do a little pilot over here where it can't hurt anyone else, see how it goes. If that works, then we'll scale it up. And then, of course, you need resources. So if you're going to do a change program, you have to fund that somehow. You have to staff it somehow. So if you're looking at what needs to change, there's different places you could look. So you might ask yourself, well, is management able to achieve its goals? It's called effectiveness. Are they doing efficiently? And efficiency is about how much do you spend in order to achieve a result. You might look at the motivational climate. So they're kind of workplace well-being surveys that look about how people feel. Are they all burned out and run down? And then among the other ones, I had to laugh when I saw capacity to test reality. What does that mean? So you're looking at this organization, and you're thinking about managers or people's capacity to test reality.
Ability to be self-aware from either an organizational or individual level, probably.
Yeah, so aware of themselves and aware of the environment. And reality, managers can have so much distance from things on the ground and in the trenches that they're basically living in a fantasy world. And they may lack knowledge of what's really going on. OD itself is a discipline that comes with its own values and sense of ethics. So we believe that OD practitioners should have expertise. You should know something about what you're doing. We tend to work as consultants, a bit independent from the organization. We expect ourselves to be committed to the job and to the program and to follow any relevant sort of code of ethics. If you are a psychologist, then that would be the code of ethics for psychologists. In practice, most IO psychologists aren't registered. I don't want to be registered. So there's a difference there between what we're saying about the field and what people are really doing. So what are OD's values? Respect for people. People should be treated with dignity and respect. They're not just resources. They're humans that we should care about. We should be able to trust our leaders. That we should equalize power. That there should be less reliance on hierarchical authority and control. The confrontation is okay. We should openly communicate about issues, not sweep things under the rug. And employees should be participating and engaged in such a way that they can develop to their full potential. Because if you're trying to impose change on someone, they won't like it if they weren't part of the decision. And if they were part of deciding what the change is, then they have more buy-in. Just as I know, Sam, you mentioned, I think, on the first day. So success depends on the congruence between those values and then what the organization actually values. And is this compatible with the values of bureaucracy and the way it works?
Not really. It's kind of the opposite.
Yeah. So off the bat, we're starting with a really big problem. Sounds like this would work well in what, like a community culture. They'd be into that. The vice president with the jokes would be into this. This runs like in the face of bureaucratic values. You want to take away control from management? You want to collaborate in a way that could be risky?
Yeah, I was going to ask, why is equalizing power one of the OD?
Exactly because of this. So if we value collaboration and engagement, you can't authentically collaborate and engage and value everyone's opinion when we're sitting in that table with head honcho on top, we're all looking at him, right? That's what happens when you're in that circular seating pattern and everyone has a voice and everyone's opinion matters. You look skeptical.
Like, what would an OD practitioner say if the military came and said, look, we need some consultation on how our organization works?
That happens, and there has been change in units, and I'm aware that has been successful when there's been that little sandbox approach.
Okay.
Let's go play over here or try new things. Hey, this unit's performing really well. Now it's kind of safe to roll it out.
So it kind of flies in the face of the assumption that the rank and file is necessary. The rank's Christmas tree shape is necessary in that context.
We don't just walk in there and say, like, everyone's opinion is equal now, right? That's
all just love and respect each other.
Yes. And the issue is the fact that as an OD practitioner, especially as an external practitioner, you have no power in the organization. Thank you. Okay? So you have a lack of power. And who are you working for? Who hired you? You're working for management. And they may, in fact, want or expect you to impose change, which flies in the face of OD values. I'm going to interrupt myself here and come back to this slide. It's the one that said that you needed to have a model for change. It turned out that my next slide had run away, but I went and found it. Here it is. And let's now think through it in the context of what we know about power in an organization. The model starts us off by creating a sense of urgency. Do you do that, or does the leader? The next step is to kick some leaders out, but what authority do you have to hire and fire the leaders, especially when they're the ones hiring you? Assuming you get this far, the next stage is to have the right players model the right behaviors, and to train the employees in the new expected behaviors. You'll also need to reward them for good behavior and punish them for bad behavior, which assumes that you have any authority to do so. Changing the reward system also means making structural changes. This model says that you end by creating new stories and symbols. That's a reference to the role of myth and narrative in an organization, to the propaganda of internal communications like the company newsletter. And I really don't think you leave that one for the end. That puts the horse after the cart. You need to know what you're changing into, what new leaders are modeling, what new behaviors you're training and rewarding, what values and assumptions those reflect. The new culture has to correspond to a new vision, new assumptions and values, and you're going to have to establish that as soon as possible, because myth and narrative function to guide and direct behavior. Don't be too quick to believe every figure you see in a management textbook or on a slide. Keep your critical thinking hat on at all times. Big bureaucracies turn around and change their culture when they have to. That often means there's been some kind of legislative change that the organization needs to get in compliance with, like human rights legislation. And as a practitioner with no personal power, it sure helps to have the force of the law behind you. In a hierarchy, authentic change can happen when the leader wants it. In practice, that means your position would be reporting directly to the president, or at least a very high-level executive. If you don't have the power, then you need it backing you. Positions that are about the optics and politics of change will be positioned much lower in the hierarchy. If the organization is serious about what you're doing, then they'll empower you with a budget and staff supporting you, like an administrative assistant. Another good sign is that leaders themselves show an understanding of power and positionality and demonstrate some honesty and humility instead of narcissism. Those are some signs that you have the green light to create real change. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions and comments? I'm happy to receive those by email or informally once I stop the recording. Your first quiz is due on Sunday by the stroke of midnight. I would say, even though it's an open book test, be prepared, okay? Because if you come in prepared, then 1 minute per question is enough time. And remember that some questions are short, but some have a bit more text, so I don't think it's good to sort of leave it till the last minute, then hope to hunt for it in the book. So I recommend being prepared. And another really good practice with testing is to look at all the questions, page through it, before you start answering, because that gives your unconscious mind a chance to get started on it. And for next class, I'll be covering power and evil in organizations. And you have 2 readings, which are posted on Brightspace. And they are by Morand and Fisk. So thank you for your attention, and I'm going to stop the recording here.